The Astronauts continued by Stanislaw, translated from the German by the Spirit of Hegel. The pilot, unsure what to do next, I remained sitting in the cabin for quite some time. Then I examined the intercom once more. The needle slid across the entire scale. All wave bands were silent. Not the slightest sound emerged from the airwaves. It was no use. I took the helmet out from under the seat and slipped it on. Conscientiously, I tightened the automatic clamps, one after the other. I awaited another moment, then pressed the lever down forcefully. The glass roof slid back. With a glance I checked the tiny dark green screen, the radar device, that glowed inside the helmet, touched the oxygen tank tap, swung my leg over the edge, and now stood on the wing. I know I will never be able to reproduce the image I saw. I can describe its details, but I cannot express in words that strange, universally predominant tone of color. The tone was the reason one immediately felt as if one were not on Earth. The clouds drifted lazily by. They were not the light, fluffy cirrus clouds of Earth, but a smooth, milky curtain that veiled the entire firmament. Illuminated by a bright light, a landscape of flat hills and hollows stretched out. It was dry, devoid of any vegetation, a deep chocolate brown, interrupted only here and there by slightly lighter patches. About 70 meters behind the tail of the aircraft began the dead forest. The threshold separating it from the plain was so high that only the tangled treetops, glittering in the reflected light, protruded above it. I jumped to the ground. It was hard and solid. I stamped my iron-shod heel, and not the slightest mark appeared. Nevertheless, the ground was nothing like bare rock. I turned my back on the dead forest. Beyond the wing of the plane, I saw only the endless, tiringly uniform, low folds of the plain. On the horizon, the outlines of mountains rose from the perpetual mist. I looked down again, took a pocket knife from the combination knife, and struck the mysterious substance with its edge. The blade popped off several times, but then I found a spot where the surface was covered with small holes, like a smooth petrified sponge. I managed to break off a fairly large piece. I took it in my hand. It was light brown and light as bakelite. Bakelite. How I regretted being alone. At that moment I was no longer thinking about the lost connection, nor about what would become of me after a few hours. I had only been glad to have one of my companions with me so I could share the unheard-of discovery with them. I looked at the strange brown landscape once more, but now with different eyes than before. There was something disturbing about it, something I hadn't noticed before. It reminded me, indeed, what could one compare it to? Suddenly I knew the whole area looked unreal, unnatural, like a giant theatre set. And that was what worried me, the immense extent of the rigid dead landscape. These hundreds of square kilometers of bakelite, or whatever it might be, some artificial plastic mass that on Earth serves as material for telephones and fountain pens. There was something grotesque and at the same time uncanny about this image. I was still standing by the airplane, not knowing what to do. Then I walked a few dozen steps toward the dead forest and quickly ran back again. For no reason at all, because I had a radio in my diving suit so I could hear the rocket signals if it would make a sound. But I ran back anyway. The stillness of the air, the flat hilly plain, strange on whose ground the tread of my boots made a strangely dry, hard thumping sound. I sat up on the wing. I turned the knife back and forth in my hand and looked over to the near edge of the plain that ended so abruptly in front of the dead forest. I considered it. If I don't manage to reunite with my companions in the next 25 or 8 hours, I'll have no air left to breathe. Well, when that time comes, I can still think about what to do. For now, I still have oxygen, food, and the plane. So what should I do? What is my duty? Investigate the ground conditions. But what if the rocket appears? What if the rocket appears and I'm far away from the plane? Before I reach it, it will surely disappear back into the clouds. and with it perhaps the last hope of rescue. So should I stay on the wing of the plane and wait for rescue? My boss at the Central Aviation Service had a favourite question he usually asked newcomers. What should a pilot do if he is forced to make an emergency landing in a desert or in the mountains? Everything possible. That had to be the answer. And if that isn't enough, then what is impossible? This may sound a bit crude and naive. One of his colleagues who had crashed his mailplane escaped the shifting sands of the desert after a 5-day march, during which he didn't have a drop of water in his mouth. When asked afterward what he had been thinking about on his march, he quoted what our chief had said. I remembered it at the time. Various factors had to be considered. The most important was probably the assumption on that the planet was inhabited. Wasn't it a tremendous recklessness to leave the aircraft unattended? Of course it was. But what other choice did I have? I climbed back onto the wings, took the small ray gun from the cabin, and slung it over my shoulder. Then I walked again towards the edge of the forest. After a while, I arrived. Below me loomed the dead forest, whose treetops in some places reached right up to me. My gaze wandered over the bushes, with long shimmering branches, conical stalagmites, semi-transparent masses that looked like flattened coils of snakes, and over bulky, thorny columns that resembled giant corals or polyps. They looked like carved growths or like frost flowers painted on window panes. The strange impression was further enhanced by the colours of the rainbow, conjured up by the refraction light of the treetops. It was like looking out over a sparkling, surging sea. After a while, I noticed that the trees were not at all chaotically jumbled. In some places, one could discern a certain order. Not far from my observation point, the edge of the threshold formed a flat stool. I climbed up to survey a larger area. About 300 meters away from me, in the depths of the dead forest, lay an extensive depression. The mineral hedges surrounding it in a ring were lower and more rounded than the others. The depression itself seemed to be completely smooth. However, I could not determine this with certainty. As it was partially obscured by the treetops, I therefore clearly saw that the dead trees grew taller and had more pointed branches the further my gaze wandered. I decided to descend and examine them up close. The threshold that ended the plain broke off vertically everywhere. About 4 meters separated me from the floor of the dead forest. I hesitated. Directly beneath me grew crystalline structures that shone with a pure, calm radiance. Curiosity was stronger than caution. At the last moment, as I was already running down the steep wall, hanging by my hands, the thought crossed my mind as to whether it would even be possible to perform such jumps in scuba gear. I pushed off slightly and landed in a deep squat on my hands and feet. I straightened up and turned my back to the wall. Before me stood the dead forest, as they had now dubbed this peculiar landscape. It looked quite different from here than from above. They were indeed a kind of glassy trunks, forking at the top into pointed side branches. Needle-like thorns protruded everywhere, covered in finer needles. Half leaves, half horns, and shimmering rainbows played everywhere. Before entering the forest, I aligned my compass with a depression visible in the distance and determined my direction accordingly. Then I entered the woods. My feet found barely any purchase in the thick layer of cracking and crunching debris. Brush-shaped violet crystal shattered beneath my iron-shod shoes. The trunks of the dead trees were twisted like a spiral, as if woven from thick glassy ropes. As the trunks were turned to the right, I tried to maintain my direction, but it wasn't easy. Every few steps I had to look at the compass. Several times I got stuck between rows of closely spaced antlers and had to find another way. After many detours, I gradually approached my goal. The round merging shapes appeared more and more frequently, while the needles, sword, and ray-shaped ones became less frequent. Colorful formations shimmered everywhere. They were reminiscent of frozen fountains, leaning on the ground with their powerful jets of water. As I forced my way through them, I had to sleep for a while before the glitter, the sudden brightening and darkening. A flickering firework of brilliance, blue, yellow, violet, and crimson, flamed in this crystal thicket. Sometimes, as if sprinkled with ash, a curved surface that had shone like pure silver from afar went out, Suddenly I found myself wedged in the narrow passage between the jets of one of the petrified fountains. I tore myself free, and the obstacle burst with such a violent crash that I shuddered and thought my helmet had burst. The further I went, the flatter the tree-like structures became, closer to the ground, the branches reaching out in all directions, intertwined, as if an invisible force were pressing them to the ground. For some time now, red flashes had been flashing before my eyes. In the blaze of colour streaming in from all the sides, I hadn't noticed them at first, thinking the light from outside was refracting in the glass window of the helmet. But the red glow suddenly intensified, and I noticed that it was coming from inside the helmet. Above the radar screen was a small dull sphere that indicated radioactive radiation. On Earth, we and the scuba divers had entered an experimental chamber, in the center of which stood a container containing radioactive substances. As one approached, a red dot in the dim sphere began to glow, growing larger as one approached the radiation source, like the glow of a smoldering lump of coal being blown upon. Here, however, this alarm device did not glow, but rather glowed like a blood-red dye, filling the interior of the helmet with flaming red. I stopped. The glare had become so intense that it was difficult for me to see. Therefore, the radiation here was exceptionally dense. It was advisable to leave this dangerous place as quickly as possible. I lowered my head before the hanging stalactites and took a few steps sideways. The red glare faded. I stepped over the veins of the shimmering mass, which wound along the ground like roots, and continued forward. The sphere glowed again. I took my hand-held radioactivity indicator out of my pocket. It looked like a small pistol and had a luminous scale, where the hammer would be on a regular pistol. Lifting the barrel, I noticed that the dead forest was by no means as idyllic a place as it had appeared from a distance. The needle danced madly across the scale, swinging with such force that it seemed as if it were about to break the locking screw. My hair was running down my forehead, and I was getting hotter and hotter, not from nervousness. The thermometer at 68 degrees Celsius. It was probably better if I forego the rest of the journey. A hike under these conditions could cost me dearly. I knew that the suit was impregnated with a substance that absorbed the radiation, but it was far too thin to protect against rays of such intensity. One was only allowed to venture here in a significantly heavier special suit armored with carmex, sheet metal. We had such equipment on board the Cosmocrator. As I thought about this, it occurred to me that I would probably never see the Cosmocrator again. Therefore, I could continue on calmly. With the indicator in my outstretched hand, I turned around, thus directing its path in all directions. The radiation increased and decreased abruptly. It was strongest when I held the barrel against the bluish grassy trunks, which were thicker and taller than the others. They were far apart, so I could only see two at a time. I approached one such trunk. It was by no means as transparent as it initially appeared. This illusion was caused by the distorted reflections reflected by the shiny surface. I brought my head closer to the trunk. The red light in the helmet flared up violently, as if a living being wanted to warn me of the danger. Inside the trunk, beneath a transparent layer, ran a narrow cylindrical tube of indeterminate color. Depending on the direction of view, it appeared dark red, silver, like an air bubble in water. I passed this spot as quickly as possible. The red ball slowly faded and shimmered only a dark ruby red. Now that I knew what to avoid, I continued along the designated azimuth, careful to steer clear of the bluish trunks. Soon they disappeared from my field of vision, but the indicator, which was more sensitive than the red lamp, showed that the entire floor was emitting weak radiation. It is not so much the intensity of the radiation that is dangerous, but rather the time the organism is exposed to it. On the screen of the device was a scale in time units, from which I read that I was allowed to stay in this area for a maximum of half an hour. I therefore quickened my pace and soon stood before a wall-like formation that resembled nothing I'd seen before. The mineral here had splintered into finger-like outgrowths, into steep elevations, covered with enormous bumps and blisters. This is roughly how I imagine soaps come under a powerful magnifying glass. Particularly peculiar was a swarm of silver globules that had melted into the mass, like a swarm of insects caught in a wave of liquid amber. I tried to climb one of these glassy elevations, but immediately slipped again. For a moment I had the feeling of being in a fairy tale forest, the night under the glass mountain. I continued walking parallel to this wall. In places it resembled a frozen wave. This impression was reinforced by the crest, as if tousled by a storm. The ascent to the wall was made difficult by a tangle of glass octahedrons. The arms that connected them, hanging in the air, had broken off in some places, and littered the ground with their broken pieces. I kicked one of the large bubbles with my iron-shod shoe. It shattered. As I placed one foot into the jagged hollow and tried to pull the other one along, it shattered into small pieces under the weight of my body, and I found myself on the ground below. I repeated the same maneuver in another place, with the same failure. This time the sharp, pointed finger fragments had almost cut my combination. I gave up further attempts, and as my compass indicated, turned east, where the transparent forest described a large arc. Suddenly I found myself standing in front of a niche that looked almost like a chimney in the rocks of our mountains. Myriads of melted silver spheres sparkled in its depths. It was a wonderful sight. I brought my face close to the vertical wall and froze in horror. A dark monster with a pointed head and protruding ears, shaped like bat wings, leaned towards me. The lower half of its body blurred into an opaque cloud. I recalled and saw that it was my own distorted reflection. I groped for handholds in this gap, which gave the impression of a gigantic crevasse. With great effort, taking advantage of every unevenness, I climbed the ledge. The heat became increasingly frightening. I had long since turned on the electric cooling device, but it didn't help much. I rose up on my tiptoes and with outstretched fingers searched for something like a handle. My heartbeat suddenly increased, pounding ever louder, louder, louder. But that wasn't my heartbeat at all. With a leap I was back down. I ignored the splinters sliding beneath my shoes. I ran, looking for a place from which I could see the entire sky. High above me, the milky white cloud cover shone. From the distance a roar sounded, coming closer, swelling. Between the layers of cloud, a long smooth spindle shimmered like a dark fish, the cosmic crater. I shouted, screamed up into the microphone, and at the same time raced towards the plane. Toward the plane. I crashed. I fell to my knees, jumped up again, and called the rocket again. The roar sounded different. The cosmic crater lowered its bow, banked, described a tight spiral, and became more intense. Behind the control surfaces, a column of fire brighter than the clouds shot out. I leaped from one tree trunk to another, ran across glass bridges, and jumped over luminous trenches. The roar of the engines grew to a deafening roar, grew quieter, and then fell silent. The rockets descended to a dangerously low altitude. I looked straight ahead and at the last moment was able to jump aside from some crystals that had jutted into the air like swords. Then a thicket of glassy veins blocked my path. I tried to take it in a jump, stumbled, scrambled to my feet. The tail ran into my eyes. I wanted to shout into the microphone. I was out of breath. A shard of glass slipped from under my feet. I lost my balance and fell again. I pulled myself up, about to rush blindly toward the next obstacle, when a quiet, ironic voice sounded close to my ear. Calm down, pilot. It wasn't the radio that had come on, but an inner voice that suddenly made me stop. There was no way out of the maze. I had to turn around and start running again. When I heard the roar of the engine steadily fading, I turned around. The rocket blurred like a ghost in the clouds. The roar of the engines faded into an ever fainter, ever more distant hum. After a while, no sound reached me. Only my panting breath inside the helmet grew louder and louder. The headphones remained silent. All around me, the most beautiful and clear as blue, yellow, gold, and raspberry-colored crystal shone. It had become quiet, completely quiet. I sat down on a flat fragment of ground and waited for 5, 10 minutes. The clouds moved languidly and unwaveringly in the same direction. From this strained staring up into this piercing brightness, my eyes filled with tears. They slowly ran down my cheeks. They weren't just involuntary tears. This is the end, I thought, and immediately the same voice answered me as before. And if that were so, what does it matter? Right, I gritted my teeth and stood up. Before I continued, I looked at the compass. During my frantic run, I had lost all sense of direction. The radioactivity was somewhat lower here than near the glass wall. Only a red dot glowed in my helmet. I stood amidst tall, bushy crystals. One had fallen to the side. On its rough, grainy surface, almost in the middle between the violet and blood-red iridescent edges, lay a silvery sphere, just like those that had been melted inside the glassy mass, and it looked like a pea-sized, slightly flattened drop. Strangely, it wasn't lying on the fragment of the crystalline bush, but rather hovered a few millimeters above it, as if suspended. I approached and stood rooted to the spot. The silvery granule trembled. It turned its slightly tapered side toward me, from which a tiny spark flashed. No, it was a tiny, hair-thin wire that protruded. At the same time, a short, ragged sounded from in my headphones. Holding my breath, I looked at the little thing. It sat on a barely visible spiral that expanded and contracted. This movement became increasingly lively. I stepped back involuntarily. It was as if this creature wanted to settle on the crystal. I approached again, and again it moved, and again a high-pitched tone sounded in the earphones. So the others were right after all. It whirled through my mind. Ants. Metal ants. I stretched out my arm to take the little creature in my hand, but suddenly let it drop. Despite its tiny size, wasn't this one of those creatures that had built a spaceship 80 years ago? Wouldn't it defend itself, perhaps with little radiation? I looked at the indicator. The radioactivity remained the same. I walked around the little thing, examined it from all sides, and noticed something very strange. Whenever I turned my head away, it froze and remained motionless, like a drop of coolest metal. But when I looked at it, it began to tremble, turned its pointed side toward me, from the end of which the tiny wire protruded, and then I heard those broken tones in my headphones. This repeated itself every time. What could it mean? Did the little creature want to tell me something? And were the others frozen in the glassy mass dead? I stood there completely perplexed. If only I had at least one of my companions at my side at that moment. It drove me to despair, since I understood absolutely nothing about it. I took out my pocket knife and placed it close to the silvery droplet. It seemed to pay him no attention whatsoever. I turned my head away and just glanced out of the corner of my eye. It froze. I moved away from a few steps. It didn't move. Then I approached again, keeping my eyes on it. Again it extended its flashing wire, the spiral moved, and the broken whistle sounded in the earpieces. Damn it! I stretched out my hand. The whistle grew louder. Nevertheless, I took it between my fingertips. Nothing happened. I held it close to the visor of my helmet. The whistle grew louder. Was this perhaps how the little creature vented its dissatisfaction? I pulled the flat metal box from my pocket, threw it in, closed the lid. In an instant, the whistle in the earpieces stopped. The metal walls of the box shielded like electromagnetic waves. That much I understood, feeling as if I were carrying a hellish machine set for an unknown hour. I set off back. After 20 minutes, I was at the plane. I immediately sat down at the radio receiver, but the airwaves were empty. Only a dense crackling sounded from nearby. 4 hours had passed since landing. I felt hungry. As I was about to close the cabin, the idea came to me to take one last look at the Venusian. I opened the box and looked inside. Just as before, the little creature trembled, pushed the wire forward, and intermittent signals sounded in the horns. I didn't even know why. It's an almost shameful moment in my memories. I had no desire to take the refreshment, so to speak, under the eyes of the strange creature. So I placed the box on the wing, closed the cabin, purified it of the poisoned atmosphere using compressed hydrogen, and then set out my supplies. My meal was interrupted when a long drawn-out tone came from the distance, which grew brighter at times and then faded away again. Of course, yes, that was the cosmocrator. I threw the open package aside, peered into the sky, and engaged the starter. The engine started. Nothing was visible yet, but the faint singing became a steady roar and grew louder by the second. Suddenly the dazzling white cloud cover parted, and from the background the rocket roared. I yelled into the microphone and simultaneously applied full throttle. An eternity seemed to pass before the aircraft lifted off the ground. Finally, I hauled it up as steeply as I could, but before I could really begin to climb, the cosmocrator had passed sideways and was already moving away again. My eyes were wide open. I stared at the rocket. It must have disappeared back into the clouds in a moment. It continued flying straight ahead. The clouds clustered together and swirled as the exhaust gases hit them. There was still nothing but rattling to be heard in the earpieces. My hands gripped the control stick convulsively. The engine did its best, in vain. The cosmocrator became smaller and smaller and finally disappeared into the milky haze. Almost at the same moment, a small sound like a recoiling spring sounded in the horns, and the flood of words and the short calls of the rocket, along with the crackling of the current, reached my ears. And then Soltik's voice, as clear and distinct as if he was speaking to me from a distance of 2 paces. On which side is the lower radiation? On the left, Arsenyev answered him, at about 8 kilometers. Engineer Soltik, I shouted so loudly that even my ears rang. Attention, cosmocrator. He's here, Arsenyev shouted. Soltik's voice, closer to the microphone, filled the entire cabin. Pilot, I hear you, pilot. What's wrong with you? Everything's fine. I suddenly felt very lightheaded. I had to pull myself together to add, I'm at 2,000 meters and following you. Then I reported in as casual a tone as possible. I found a pretty decent person. To hell with the landing site, Soltik shouted. Man, where have you been? At first I didn't know what to answer. It was a good thing that Soltik had switched to an official tone. Should we give you our course? No need, I'm on your bearing. Listen, pilot, said Soltik shouted, as if suddenly remembered something very important. What's your gyro compass? You're about 6 kilometers behind us. Don't go beyond the 8 degrees, even for a short time. Better keep half a minute further east. Why? Because that damned radioactive forest is there. The radioactive forest, I repeated, looking at my compass. What's the harm in that? Well, the radio waves are fading there. The radio waves are fading? I felt a strong urge to slap myself hard on the forehead. I, the idiot. There must have been a thick layer of ionized air above the forest. It was obvious that this entire area was inaccessible to radio waves. And I, the idiot I was, hadn't thought of that. Donkey, I repeated silently. Why were you circling the forest earlier? I asked Soltik. Maybe an hour and a half ago. You saw us, Soltik shouted. You were there, didn't I say so? He turned to someone else. Then back to me. I heard the plane's tracking signals as we flew past there. I called you and we circled the forest for a good quarter of an hour. But the reception there is so poor that I finally thought I was mistaken. You weren't mistaken, I replied quietly. Now everything became clear to me. The whole time the onboard radio had been sending signals automatically, even when I was wandering around the dead forest. Since the aircraft was some distance from the forest, probably the edge of the ionized zone, Soltic had heard the signals and had therefore also been circling over the plane. There was only one thing I couldn't understand. Did you see the aircraft? I asked. No. Had you landed? Yes. That was strange. From an altitude of 5,000 meters they hadn't seen the plane. Suddenly, I glanced at the wing and then a light bulb went off. Some clever engineer I'd ordered the fuselage and wings to be sprayed light brown, citing highly scientific considerations about Venus' atmosphere, radiation, and so on. Consequently, the plane had blended so well with the colour of the ground that it hadn't been noticeable even at lower altitudes. There was nothing to detect on the radar either, I asked. Interference, eh? Yes. I had to pay attention now because a glowing ring appeared in the centre of the radar screen. That meant I wasn't far from the rocket. Can you see us, pilot? No, I replied. No matter how hard I strained my eyes, there was nothing but thick, milky fog around me. Then I switched to the radar. How are you feeling? I switched to the radar. How are you feeling? Excellent. Soon afterward, the radar screen showed the shortened spindle of the cosmic crater. Soltic reported. I'll begin announcing 8-15. 8-15, I repeated. Slightly pressed the throttle and simultaneously climbed a little higher. I tried to keep the image of the rocket in the radar crosshairs. The aircraft had to get within 15 meters of the rocket, which wasn't too difficult if you followed the instrument readings exactly. 6-6, I repeated. Another minute and the cloud above me darkened. I no longer needed to stare at the radar screen. From the white depths of space, the fuselage of the missile emerged. I see you, I shouted, checking the readings on the measuring instruments. 1-8. 1-8 is, Soltic replied. Attention, we're switching to HT. HT means auxiliary fuel. During the takeover maneuver, the rocket was not powered by the nuclear engines, as the aircraft could enter the stream of their recall gases, and that would have been tantamount to disaster. Therefore, they used the auxiliary fuel, a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. The rhythmic roar of the rocket engines faded into a high plaintive tone. The compression of the reaction turbines roared. I carefully raised the control stick. The huge curved belly of the cosmic crater was already casting its cool shadow over me. 6/10. 6/10. Now the course and speed of the aircraft and the rocket had to match exactly. With extreme excitement, I followed the pointer on the measuring instruments and adjusted the throttle, millimeter by millimeter. 0, attention, 0. 0 is. The cosmic crater hung close above me. I felt as if I only had to reach out my hand to touch the matte silver plates of the armor. A dull rumble. The hatches on both sides fell down. The cargo hatch stood open and the aircraft was pulled upwards by a magnetic field. The moment it became dark around me, I turned off the engine. The locking flaps rattled. Another clang of metal against metal, and the prongs of the elastic straps had absorbed the weight of the machine. I heard the piercing hiss of compressed air blowing the planet's atmosphere out of the lock. Then everything fell silent, and the lights lit up.